Oh, hello. This is Wade Frazier. This is April 7th, 2026, 5:09 p.m. This is going to resume my series of posts on Brian O'Leary video posts. Um, and the basic point of so much of my work, particularly these posts, is to show the people I'm seeking how I came to my approach. Now, this post will be a key one. This is supposed to be a key one on that because this was the last time, and last time I will try to do something like a mass movement effort for doing free energy. It has to aim higher, has to aim higher than the mass movement stuff. Uh, I was an athlete in college, you know, star student, etc. But I was never a ladies' man. I wasn't the kind of guy who seduced women. In fact, women had to usually throw themselves at me before I would do anything about it. But two of my high school teachers, though, were star athletes at my high school when they were in school, and then they became teachers later. And both of them, when they were in the early 40s, they slept with their students. One went to prison. In fact, I lived in Ohio at the time, and it made national news. So my teacher lived in my same neighborhood. He went to prison, and then, God, a year later or something, another teacher who actually I was pretty close to. He was my science, biology, and chemistry teacher in school, high school, and anyway, and he coached a water polo team. He did the same thing. He only made the state news, but again, career over kind of thing. And I watched athletes. So I was an athlete. I knew, again, my buddies are athletes, and I saw people who are athletes cripple themselves in their early 40s doing stupid stuff like playing football after Thanksgiving dinner, etc. Standard midlife crisis stuff. So for me, and again, I was waiting for mine. So in fact, these Casanova and athlete midlife crises, I was ready. I was just ready for it to come, so I'd show at the door. My midlife crisis would be over in a couple of minutes. Ah, fool. Yeah, so midlife crises are made to order. So yeah, so I sat in my living room waiting for it to appear, so I could send it on its way. Except my midlife crisis was about the idea that my life's work was an exercise in futility. That's what mine was about. And I um I was in it for probably a year before I realized that I was in it. And yeah, my midlife crisis began uh summer of '99, I think. In fact, the summer I did my wrote my war essay. So every day I was studying the Holocaust, studying World War II, studying all that carnage, writing about it, and I and my drinking problem. I had been starting to stop drinking for almost 10 years at that time, and and in fact that summer I think finally gave me the impetus. But it wasn't until I started year-round hiking later that autumn, and I think that was the key. So that was so I finally stopped drinking there in 2000, which was a good thing because just in time. Just my little midlife crisis hit like a ton of bricks. I had stopped drinking. If I hadn't stopped drinking by then, I might not be alive today. I would have probably drank myself to death. So anyway, so that was good. Uh, and in 2000, actually, I did me called a midlife hiking backpack. So I actually, when I was in my 20s with my cousin, there's some lakes in this state, Washington State, that are extremely difficult to get into. And one of them was on, even life risking to get into. And one of them was on, and when I met Dennis in '86 and moved away, I remember when I did that, I thought that maybe I'll when if I ever get back home to Washington, I'll be too old to do those big trips. And that turned out to be accurate. So when I was 42 in 2000, I tried to get into this lake, which was an incredibly difficult lake to get into. And Fortunately, we got snowed out right at the part where we could see the route going into that lake. And my friend Brad, he took one look at the route and he said, "I'm not doing that." And I didn't argue against it. And then, of course, a 2 day snowstorm hit, and that was it. I never tried it. I never tried anything like that again. But I was in constant emotional agony from 1999 to actually late 2006 when I got an invitation to the White House. And in the aftermath of that, my wife once again insisted that I get trauma therapy, and I did, and it worked. And so, but by the autumn of 2006, the clouds began to part. And again, I wrestled with the bottle and all that. It damaged my marriage, and you know, the 9/11 terror attacks were a milestone. Again, in the previous post on Brian, I wrote about our meeting in August of 2001. And when the 9/11 terror attacks hit, I watched, and I've written about this enough, I won't get into it today, but I watched the two towers smoking before they fell, and I actually laughed. And I realized that my efforts were too little and too late. And everything that's happened since then hasn't been too awful surprising. As the empire has rampaged across the world. And then Mr. Professor's death in May of 2002. His life was ruined and shortened because he got involved with me in our free energy quest. That really sent me into the dark phase. Yeah, so 2002 to 2006, it was just agonizing. And then, of course, he died in May of 2002. And then soon thereafter, there was this drumbeat for the invasion of Iraq, which was all based on lies, etc. In fact, as Noam Chomsky wrote, the invasion of Iraq right now is the crime of the century. Yeah. Any crime greater than that may end up, ending humanity. So we'll see how it goes. But yeah, that was just a nightmare. A nightmare for me to watch the drumbeat, all the lies coming from the Bush people, etc., leading up to the invasion of Iraq for the non-existent weapons of mass destruction, all that kind of stuff. And I was unemployed. So I'd actually finished my website. My wife actually gave me a deadline, ultimatum. I finished my initial website in September of 2002. And then I was pretty much unemployed for almost the next year. And then comes again the invasion of Iraq in March of 2003. Just as I was really resuming my science studies. This is after I reading Fuller and the peak Oilers, etc. So that's when I really started resuming my science studies in earnest. But having a front row seat to that invasion was a complete nightmare for me. I mean, such a nightmare. And then actually that spring I got a job. In fact, I worked for the Seattle Supersonics for a month, temping their controller on a maternity leave. And then I heard from Brian, literally around the same time, asking me. I hadn't really, so when we got together there in the summer of 2001, didn't really hear from him after that until in the spring. It was maybe April or May of 2003. I mean, I think it was just as the dust was settling from the invasion, mission accomplished, etc., that I heard from Brian. And Brian said he's gonna found a free energy effort. In fact, by that time, Brian was now calling it new energy. And new energy just means it's from a source not currently recognized, which 0 point energy, I think, would qualify it as that. So anyway, so Brian asked me to found this organization with him. And it was Brian, so I couldn't say no. I said, it's okay, I'd do that. And it turned out that Brian, in 2001, he had lived in Colorado, but he actually moved to California, to the foothills of the Sierras, literally about 40 minutes from where my wife's parents lived. And so it was convenient because we were regularly visiting my wife's parents, and so we went there a lot. So I was able to kill two birds with one stone: visit family, and also see Brian there. In fact, he lived on the Yuba River, which I also was familiar with. Again, this is all that area. I was very familiar with it, uh, and Dennis Lee was still barnstorming the country. Yeah, I don't. Again, I didn't see how what Dennis was doing was going to work, and so yeah, and all that right wing stuff, I was pretty much done with that. And we're supporting something like that, really. And when I met the day I met Dennis, again, a bodyguard, and he also this mass movement effort of competing with the electric companies. And I worked in 4 different states for Dennis in 4 different mass movement efforts. And but I wasn't quite done with mass movement efforts. So and again, Brian Dennis was always this right wing Christian, patriot, business opportunity stuff. And Brian, again, Mr. Lefty, advisor of all those Democratic and independent presidential candidates, and he wanted to get again. He did Paul Revere for energy stuff led it into this, and again, Brian called it the new energy movement, and and Brian again. So Brian was a lefty, although like me. So I was raised in a right wing household, like Brian was, but we both became more left. Let's say, yeah, I never voted Republican in my life, and so that was game. So Brian was like, "Wait, let's do something." So he invited me down, and so he lived there, again, down there in the foothills of the Sierras, California, not too far from Tahoe, Lake Tahoe, and so I went down there, and this was in June. It was early June 2003, and so went down there to see what Brian had in mind, and 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 I've written about this a lot in my work. It's that by I worked again with Dennis in 96, 97 briefly, and by the end of that stint, I was done with inventors. I was done with so much. I just saw how those approaches would not work. And again, and I'll get to this in future posts because I've sort of interrupted the flow of my oral history here, but I spoke at the Department of Energy hearings with Dennis in '97, and anyway, and I'll get into that later. Anyway, all those approaches was just I didn't see they were going to work, and Dennis definitely gave it his best efforts, but it was just Indiana Jones can't do it by himself, and it was just yeah, and it says free energy efforts have few allies and many enemies, and a sleeping public. So anyway, but Brian was gonna go for the right wing, and I've written that I actually contacted Noam Chomsky back in '92, with a 17-page letter I was driven from my sleep to write, asking why the left media never covered the free energy topic, and Noam actually suggested that maybe there's no resources for that. And I later learned it was an ideological aversion. It was just free energy is too wild for the left largely to wrap its head around. And again by my first stint with Dennis back in the '80s, I had strong doubts that the businessman's approach would work, that inventors really, again, I was raised with the idea that inventors are heroes. I was disabused of that delusion. In fact, and then in '96, '97, I was done. I was done thinking inventors had really the answers. They're just some small pieces of the puzzle. Uh, and again, Dennis's right wing, religion and nationalism and business opportunities. I was done with all that. And but Brian was going to try some left wing kind of mass movement thing. So and, it was Brian asking me. So I said yes. I said, okay, Brian, I'll help. And so and I went, and when I became Dennis's partner, um, we didn't even know there was a free energy field, right? You never heard of Nikola Tesla, and but we began learning fast. And again, I began seeing how the free energy field was in a state of arrested development. around inventors and, and business plans and all this kind of stuff. And again, hit men and women being sicked on us in the media, and then the global elites were orchestrated a lot of that. Uh, and in the free energy field itself, I eventually just saw that there were all these, criminal. There was definitely a criminal element in the free energy field. Scam artists and greedy inventors who think they're the Messiah, and oh man, and then Bill Delp, that hitman from the Bonneville Power Administration, who joined the U.S. Psychotronics Organization. Again, those kind of fringe science organizations were riddled with CIA spooks, agents from the global elite, et cetera. So this was all stuff that I had learned. I had learned all this. So here's Brian going to start another one. Huh. So I definitely I was curious to see what again. I wanted to find out. I want to find out if what Brian was wanted to do it had a chance. And so I did. I signed up with them. And again, again, I was unemployed there in June of 2003. So anyway, I was uh, I was game. So and what I'm gonna do because this post could be several hours long. I'm really trying to keep it short. But back to all the scoundrels and criminals in the free energy ranks. I'm going to discuss briefly two of them here because it'll be relevant later as we shall see. So and and as usual, when people are still alive like this, I won't name them. Like Bill Dip, I didn't name him until after he was dead. These guys go, I'll link to them because they're out there still publicly. So I'll link to their right. I won't name them, but I will link to them. So it's not easy. It's easy to discover their identities. Um, and one was a guy that actually Dennis told me about in 1996. So when Dennis was with Yule Brown in 96, and again, we ordered over $1 million of Brown's gas machines from China and stuff. There was this guy who actually would copy Brown's gas machine. He was a copycat guy. I'll call him Mr. Copycat. So Mr. Copycat he would copy Brown's gas technology and sell competing equipment, just as Dennis is trying to build a movement around Yule Brown. So it was something that really could take the wind out of your sails. And so, Dennis wanted to, I was working again. He was another global elite provocateur of some kind, to take the wind out of the sails of people like Dennis. How to say it? I doubt it, but this again back to the 1% conspiracy, 99% complicity. I think this guy was just greedy. Somebody close to him told me that. Yeah, the guy was just probably greedy, and so. Anyway, so he was doing knockoff Brown's gas machines, selling them right when Dennis was trying to build something around the Yule Brown stuff. And so, and Mr. Copycat, he has since taken down most of his writings on Dennis and Yule. But I remember one of them, he was really critical of Dennis. Yeah, he really is. And he hectored Dennis, and I remember one time he basically wrote that. Yule Brown died penniless and treated so terribly by Dennis, etc. And when I saw that, I was just like, you punk, because I saw the $250,000 payment that Dennis paid Yule. It's his commission for those Brown's gas machines we bought. He treated Yule like a king and paid him like one. And Yule Brown returned the favor by just totally betraying Dennis and leaving him high and dry. Yeah, and I was already kind of done with inventors. I wouldn't have hitched my wagon to Yule Brown, but Dennis did, and it really cost him. Really cost him hitching his wagon to Yule Brown. So a guy who was actually selling knockoff Brown's gas stuff, never paid Yule a penny, criticizes Dennis, for leaving Yule penniless, which was. And I'll just say maybe this guy's ignorance excuses him, but that's all it is. He's ignorance. So, anyways, Mr. Copycat, I heard about him in 96 from Dennis. And I said, this guy's basically just a thief. Like when I saw Dennis last year, I mentioned the guy and Dennis said, yeah, the guy's just a thief. And And I actually, when Dennis told me about this guy in '96, I knew about some of it. I didn't know all of it. And so, actually, in Jean Manning's first free energy book, written in the '90s, she actually had a profile on Mr. Copycat, and he also copied Dennis's heat pump stuff to try to do free energy with it. Yeah, so this guy, I don't think this guy had an original thought. He was just able to copy what other people did. And this is just in all of the ugliness in our world in the free energy field. This is, I call him Mr. Copycat. So he's just a guy trying to piggyback on what other people do. So, there's all sorts of low integrity kind of stuff going on. So just another one. And in fact, Jean, in her first free energy book, she also, covered Sparky Sweet, which I write about a lot. And actually, she also mentioned Joule. And yeah, again, Joule, Dennis's experience with Joule was, I could go on about Joule, but it's a thing where when Joule left Dennis high and dry like that, that was, there was more coming with other inventors, but that was when that one happened, I was pretty much done with inventors. I just realized that they're really a small piece of the puzzle, and they're not trustworthy. That's the thing with inventors. It's like they're all trying to get rich and famous and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, they're very, very selfishly motivated in general. And so anyway, so Mr. Copycat, when Brian invited me to help found the new energy movement, I'll call it NEM. When he invited me to found that, I hadn't thought about Mr. Copycat for years. It was just, again, there's so many like him. So I just, I really don't. I don't waste my time, thinking about people like that much. And there's another scoundrel that I became aware of. In fact, in 2001. So back in early 2001, as I was working on my moon landings and JFK hit, etc. It was around that time that I actually read this article in 2001, and this guy he smeared Dennis in an article, and again, link to it, people can see it, and I'm going to quote the guy. And so anyway, in his article, he said. In fact, early in the article, they actually mentioned Dennis by name. Actually, another guy was doing heat pumps, and he had just thinking it was going to be free energy, and he listed it as a possible free energy avenue, but then informed his reader that he wasn't referring to Dennis, which is kind of odd. And but I guess it made sense later because in this section where he smeared Dennis, he didn't name Dennis, but anybody in the field knew who it was. And so in the pertinent passages here, then there are the outright con men. In the last 15 years, there is one person in the USA who has raised the free energy con to a professional art. He has raised more than $100 million, has been barred from doing business in the state of Washington, has been jailed in California, and is still at it. So I remember I read that in 2001. It's like, and in fact, I saw all the money that went through Dennis's hands in the time period where this guy is saying Dennis raised $100 million. That's at least a $90 million exaggeration. So more like $5 to $10 million is what Dennis so-called raised from the public. And so and that was the only number the guy put in his essay was that number, which was a big lie. So your $100 million is sort of this big splashy number that he could use to basically beat his readers over the head. And then also barred from doing business in Washington State and jail in California, as if those officials were trying to protect the public. Yeah, in fact, I'll write this more in the future, but Dennis's adventures should be exhibited. It should be chapter 1 of any book, of any effort that thinks it's going to do free energy. This should be a required study for anybody who thinks they're going to try to pursue free energy. It's an odyssey like none other that I know of. And Dennis is by far the greatest person I've ever met and will ever meet. And so anyway, it's just cheap lies. So this guy just, sort of smeared Dennis with a series of lies. And in fact, he began his section on that, which is kind of a disinformation tactic that I'm familiar with. So they'll either start or finish their smear job with these kind of disinfo bombs. And that was the one this guy did. And so anyway, and this, and then this guy actually uses Doctor of Science after his name as if he has a scientific doctorate. My understanding is that he doesn't, though. So so here's a guy actually inflating his credentials, probably disingenuously, and then smearing Dennis. And again, the guy's not worth. He's not worth 10 seconds of my time. But I'll. This will be. You'll see. This will become relevant really quickly here. Um, yeah. So when I read that back in 2001, I just another one of these guys, another the peanut gallery, right? These guys that all they can do is sit around and smear people like Dennis, and I ignored him. I was like, okay, that guy's just more of the same. Except that guy. So soon after that, people started giving me and sending me links and actually literally give me hand copies of this guy's essay that smears Dennis as the premier free energy commentary. And it blew me away. I mean, it was like, how could you, some people in the field actually knew the field. I mean, that sentence that when he smeared Dennis, he didn't name him, but anybody in the field knew it was Dennis. So I actually remember hearing from people in the field going, "Look what this guy's doing to Dennis." And I said, "Yeah, he's just another one of the creeps out there. I ignore him." I've been given that at least a dozen times over the years. In fact, to this day, it still haunts me. I still get, yeah, it doesn't go 25 years later, it still has not gone away in my life. And I'm doomed to continually have to deal with that. Brian actually, his suppression syndrome, that was a better effort than that guy's essay anyway. I mean, this guy took a multifaceted, approach like I do, I guess. But again, you spend a sentence smearing a guy telling big lies. It's how to say it. That was criminal behavior. It's called criminal libel what this man did. So I call him Mr. Libeler. So this guy is Mr. Libeler. And so uh yeah, and again, I'm guessing that when he didn't name Dennis in that section, but he named him earlier in the essay, it was probably maybe to avoid libel charges. Be my guess. He was trying to avoid legal action the way he cleverly did that. So, but again, it ended up duping a lot. Again, all those people who kept handing me and sending me this as the premier commentary. Crazy. So anyway, Mr. Copycat and Mr. Libeler, I just dismissed them as more of what you see in the field. Unfortunately, this is our world. Again, personal integrity is a world's scarcest commodity. So, yeah, I had better things to do than be concerned by what Dennis's assailants like that. In fact, Mr. Skeptic, who I also don't name, but I linked to the guy. He was stalking me on the internet for many years, at least more than a decade. He stalked me on the internet. In fact, he tried to contact me last year. For some of the stuff Dennis is doing stirred this guy up. So he's he's trying to contact me. He won't get a nanosecond of my time. These people are just amazing, amazing that the all this kind of crap persists. And the relevancy will come soon on this. So anyway, so Brian, his rise of Paul Revere Free Energy didn't go too well. Again, back to all these crazy reactions to denial and fear you'd get from leading scientists and progressives and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, so where Brian moved, in fact, I think it was called Washington, California, as I recall, the name of the town. And Brian's backyard was literally the Yuba River. And in fact, Brian and I, the day after our first board meeting for the New Energy Movement, he and I swam in that river with his wife and a neighbor. That was fun. But when I got there, but I was really curious. So again, I watched Dennis and his right-wing stuff, etc. And a handful of all the thousands and thousands of people that were involved with Dennis and stuff, it was like there's just a mere handful that I was like, okay, these are they have the right stuff, they're giving it their best, etc. I mean, there wasn't much of that, and so yeah, that's the hazard of selling business opportunities, I would say, part of that. But anyway, so when I got there, in fact, again, I stayed at my wife's parents' house, about 40 minutes away. And we got to Brian's house there on a Saturday, as I recall, in again early June 2003. Like, hey, Brian. And anyway, it was a nice house, I mean, big home. He lived there right on the water. And anyway, and Brian introduced me to this guy who was also going to be a board member, and Brian said, "You guys should get to know each other." So sit down. We sat on the veranda there overlooking the Eva River, and you know, like for a half hour maybe. And so he told me a little bit about himself, and this guy, he was a corporate guy. So again, I spent when I wasn't playing Free Energy Revolution, I worked in corporate America myself, CPA, et cetera. And this guy was also, he had a corporate career, a little younger than me, a few years younger than I was. And anyway, and he was again, clean cut corporate looking guy like me. And anyway, so Brian is telling me to introduce myself to this guy. So we sat down, and my journey is not easy to tell in a few minutes. But I've done this enough times in my life, so I have there's a 20-minute version of my journey, which I can tell, which is full of unbelievable stuff to most people. But in theory, if it's this new energy movement, these people, how to say it, my story shouldn't have been too outlandish. But so I did my 20-minute I gave a 20-minute sketch of my background on my journey. And when I got to my day on the witness stand and how the prosecution was making faces at me and trying to intimidate me as I testified, that guy looked at me like I was crazy. And actually at that moment, I should have told Brian. I said, Brian, thank you so much for this, but I don't think I'm going to get involved. That's what I should have done, because anybody who thinks that my journey is like some crazy, they should not be involved in trying to make free energy happen. Again, back to Dennis's journey, my journey. This should be Exhibit A. This should be people should study our journeys if they're going to try to make a dent in these areas. Yeah, but anyway, but I was looked at like I was crazy. And at that moment, I was just like, I should have. And again, hindsight's a great thing, but at that moment, I should have bowed out. I should have. But it was Brian who asked me. I couldn't turn him down. So, anyways, then we had a meeting, and there were several people there. I can put this on pause for just a second. So there were, I believe there were 7 of us for that first board meeting. Brian, me, this new guy, I'll call him Mr. Newcomer. And then Alden Bryant was there. And Alden impressed me. So Alden was an environmentalist. In fact, the only environmentalist I ever met, ever heard of, I think, who embraced free energy. The idea of it. Yeah, he was a one-off in the environmental field. And Brian and Alden was very accomplished. In fact, he's the guy who initiated and organized the Rio Summit back in 1992. And yeah, Alden was in his 80s. So there's Alden in his 80s. I was 45. Alden was in his 80s. He was an old guy. And then he brought a buddy with him. And again, Alden was a Berkeley radical guy. The guy with him was in his 90s. Yeah, this black guy, his black friend Alden, the guy was like 92 or something. And he was going demented. So in fact, the next year he didn't even recognize me. Yeah, this guy was demented. And so, and then there was another kid who was a youngster. And this kid kept begging money from everybody, including me. Yeah, it was like he needed money to be involved with us. And Brian tried to discipline the kid. I was like, yeah, we could. How to say it? This movement had to be people who were giving, not getting. I mean, if you had to beg money to be involved, you shouldn't have been involved. And so, anyways, but this kid was involved, and then Alden had an assistant, the woman. So there was this Hispanic woman who was an assistant. She was probably 40, something like that. And Anyway, it was the seven of us, and we met for I don't know 2 3 hours, I guess, talking, and I got to have I guess kind of my comprehensive SADU degree, and that's what I was really. I was already a comprehensivist as I learned from Bucky Fuller's pupil, but those are really my early days of really thinking consciously, comprehensively. And so I'm sure I had some comprehensive things to say. And after 2 3 hours, in fact, Brian Meredith was there, his partner, and after at the end of that, the Alden's assistant brought out a bunch of marijuana, and anyway, so they retired to the back room to smoke weed after our meeting. That was just, in fact, Brian, so Carl Sagan, who recruited Brian for their Cornell, Carl Sagan was an inveterate marijuana smoker. In fact, Sagan really he was an activist trying to get it legalized. In fact, Sagan thought his best ideas came when he was stoned. And I'm sure that Carl and Brian shared a bowl or two there at Cornell. And so, yeah, 60 children, right? That kind of thing. It was never my trip, but they were into that. So, and then the woman, I left. In fact, the next day I came to see Brian. So Brian and I hung out the next day, but that woman was really sort of disruptive, let's say. In fact, Brian asked her not to come back. So anyway, that first meeting. So I went back and I was working. No, actually, I wasn't working yet, right? So I was between just before I started my new career position. So the next month in July, I actually began at a software company there in Bellevue, and actually I worked there for 10 years. And then my career was always 50 to 60 hour weeks. That's just how the careers like mine went. And so, but that first meeting was I wasn't working. So anyway, it was a uh, that was the beginning of the new energy movement, or NEM. And again, it was a thing where I was really wondering. I was really interested to see what Brian was going to be able to, what were his plans, what was he going to do. And so anyway, but it was this pretty much this kind of left wing mass movement thing, which was yeah, that's what he was trying to do, put together some similar to an environmental movement. And that's essentially I think what it was, but it was based around new energy. And so anyway, and again uh, I had seen so much, you know, denial and fear and the rest of this stuff that part of me was. And again, Brian, he gave me his reactions a couple years earlier, and I was brought as a Paul Revere for energy win. I mean, it was obviously going to be an uphill battle. But Brian, again, I was going to see what left connections he had, et cetera, and see how that would all go, even though his rise Paul Revere didn't go so well. And so, yeah, Alden he was the guy. So Alden, I was impressed with Alden. The others, not so much. And so, and I look back, it was a thing where I was the only one who actually been through the free energy meat grinder. None of the others had, and so it's a thing where, yeah, it was how to say it. Unless you've been through something, those kind of experiences, you're going to be naive. You're not going to learn many of the lessons that you need to learn if you're going to be, productive in this area. And they weren't. So these people weren't. All of them was hip. So all of them was hip to free energy inventors, what happened to them and stuff, as Brian was too. But the other. And one of them actually had been sort of involved in free energy, kind of in a lab, but really not on the hardcore activist front like I had been. And so it's a thing where, again, these people really hadn't been through it. So yeah, there's nothing like experience. So it's like these people really hadn't been through those kind of wars. I respected a lot of what Alden had done. Again, he'd been an environmental activist for a long time, so I'm sure he saw a lot. But this guy called Mr. Newcomer, he had experienced almost none of that. And in fact, at that first meeting, I was talking about, speaking at church groups and this kind of stuff. And I was like, I've been there, done that. And that's what Dennis was trying to do. And so it was like, I've seen that, and it was just a thing where, um, yeah, this whole thing of thinking you're going to run out and chat up people and then speak at, public venues, et cetera, and get all these people all excited and stuff. My experience was that no, that doesn't happen. Again, but Dennis was offering business opportunities, and again, waving the flag and banging the Bible and business opportunities. So it's a thing where that's how we got action, let's say. But again, like I said, in a room of 1,000 people that would come together, maybe one really had the right motivation. The rest of them were there for other reasons. So uh, so I left that meeting. In fact, the next day, Brian and I hung out for a few hours, and we were talking about Wade's World, and again, I as I look back, I'm like, I should have been more alarmed than I was, and so I should have like said, well, wait a minute here, this probably isn't, I mean, this crew isn't going to get much done, and so, but I was or had I was going to pay the price of admission to see what Brian could make happen. And so, and my wife and I, again, we visited her parents each Christmas, and for many years we did that. And so, in fact, we did our Christmas trip. We went down for Christmas that year, and again, Brian actually held a meeting. The second, I think it was the second meeting, second board meeting. God, there might have been another one, but I think it was the second one, and and it was a meeting there at his home. It was around Christmas. And this one though, it wasn't just seven of us. It was like over 20 of us. Yeah, 25 people maybe or something. It was in fact I've seen pictures of us and got together as a group at that one. And that's why I met Gene Manning there. In fact, Mark Cummings. So I met Mark again a couple years earlier there at the state capitol. And when Brian was trying to interest the energy advisors of the governor, um, and actually there I heard Brian give the short version of his adventures, and I've again it's been published for years, the longer version of what Mark went through, and so. Mark that was definitely a very sobering thing that Mark went through to invent a free energy prototype in the basement of Lawrence Berkeley. And I'm getting fired and interrogated and then trying to hide out and do it in secret and then being found out and have everything confiscated. And that's no fun, but that wasn't the meat grinder. But it messed him up. So I remember Mark told me he lived in a tent for years and stuff, trying to deal with all the stuff he had lived through there. And he had family issues around all this, which is also normal. And so I respected his experience, but he was the only, other than me, he was the only other guy who'd been through anything like that. And I went through it for years. It was, I had, you know, 4-year odyssey that wrecked my life. And so that was, and it shortened lives and shattered lives. And what a nightmare. So yeah, I was still the only guy. So I was, even on the 25 people or something, nobody had been through it like I had been through it. And I could just tell that the lessons that I learned, none of these people had learned them. Again, there's no teacher like experience, and none of these people had been on that high road before. So it was, yeah, that was gradually, how to say, it, disappointing. Again, I got to see that these people were, they were enthusiasts and dabblers and newcomers and all this kind of stuff, but there weren't really any grizzled veterans. Yeah, not really. Um, and so anyway, so I did that. In fact, that winter, so around at Christmas time, etc. And actually, Brian introduced me to Eugene Malov. And Malov, he was a MIT science writer. In fact, he saw the cold fusion cover up, and in fact, spoke out, quit, I believe, ended his career at MIT, and then he actually, in fact, it's still around. Infinite Energy magazine is what he founded, and he wrote an essay talking about paths of free energy, and one of them was, again, heat engines and heat pumps kind of stuff we were trying to do when we got wiped out. And so he wrote about that, and anyway, I had Brian introduce me to him, and we traded email. So I traded email with Eugene, and In fact, sent him patents and this kind of stuff that winter. But he was up to his eyeballs, very busy, and yeah, he was one of the many scientists I encountered who said, the second law of thermodynamics is not really valid, this kind of thing. And anyway, he was one of the many scientists who thought that free energy, the way that Dennis was trying to go about it, or my mentor, was possible. Beats me, but this is Mello was one of quite a few that I encountered who thought, yeah, maybe you can do it that way. Although Sparky Sweets device would be the winner, in my opinion. 0 point energy stuff. What Sparky had, that's the good stuff. My friend saw his underground technology show, that's the good stuff. Yeah, the heat pumps and heat engines and stuff is pretty primitive compared to that stuff, as far as I know. So Melov and I had some exchanges that winter, and then we were off doing our own thing. I was, the beginning of the year till the spring is the busiest time of the year for what I did. I did the financial reporting, SEC filings and stuff. That's what I did. And so that was the busiest time of year, getting 10Ks out and proxies and all this kind of stuff. So in May, though, back when I was pretty much done with my annual my 70-hour weeks for 4 months straight came to an end there by early May. And Brian called a meeting, another board meeting there at his house there in early May. And so I went down there and went to this board meeting. And at this board meeting, the big topic was the amount of conference. And so, and again, back to a little voice in my head was like, uh-oh, what are we doing now? Because, I met Brian at a conference, right? I met him at a USA annual annual meeting with the U.S. Psychotronics Association. But I was graduating. In fact, Dennis and I, we had greatest energy. We had shows, greatest energy shows on Earth and stuff. And Dennis spoke at the conference of a spinoff organization. And then when I was with Dennis in 96, 97, and Dennis was, putting 5,000 people in a stadium, etc. I realized, again, I experienced this enough times where these when you do conferences or shows, etc., in the audience are going to be spooks and other people trying to figure out how they're going to take you out. There's going to be people there seeing how they could steal it, all this kind of stuff. People meeting their social needs, and again, opportunities. I said, if 1 in 1,000 had the proper motivation, that was a good show. That's just how it was, and eventually you understand this. And so putting on those kind of shows and conferences and stuff is actually life-risking activity. It can be really life-risking. In fact, in the medical, people getting murdered at such conferences is that stuff happens. And so anyway, so to me it was a conference. It's like, oh, what are we going to get done at a conference? And so let me put this on hold for just a second. So yeah, so for me a conference was like, oh no, I was kind of like, oh no, not a conference. But I had committed to helping Brian, so I was like, okay, let me see if I can help. And so actually, I was making money then. I'm making pretty good money, and so I decided I would. I said, hey, I will fund the booking the facility. So I put the seed money up for this conference, and it's going to be in Portland, where Mr. Newcomer, that's where he lived, and so it was going to be all put. And he was doing a lot of leather work without putting it on. In fact, at that meeting, that very meeting, he was talking about how he needed to make about 100,000 a year through NAM to do this, and I was trying to dissuade him. I said, hey, treat NAM like your hobby. Like your your most avid hobby, but treat it as a hobby. Don't give up your day job to do this, man. And so, well, he didn't listen, and he kept trying to chat up his company. He thought he could walk through the halls telling his company about free energy, and everybody was like, "Oh yeah, yeah." This is again, they seen this show more than once, and so that's a good way to get fired and have your career. Well, that's what happened. They fired him for doing that. So, and I just, oh, it was so painful to see. It ended his career. It was so painful to see this guy do that. And it was like, and he's not the only guy I've tried to talk out of doing that kind of stuff. It's like, yeah, I'm sorry, you can't walk through the halls talking up free energy and thinking that everybody's just going to wake up and go, wow, yeah, free energy. Instead, you're going to get, you're going to lose your job. And that's what happened. He lost, we worked there for like 20 years. It's a big corporation. Lost, yeah, it's the end of his career. And hell, it was so painful to see that. But anyway, so I was like, okay, let me, I'll put up the money to secure a facility there in Portland, et cetera. And so there we go. And then anyway, so then they started planning. And so the first thing is like, let's have, let's plan to have speakers. What luminaries in the free energy field are we going to have speak at this conference? And I'm not kidding. The first names that came up, so Malov came up, and then Mr. Libeler and Mr. Copycat. And we're like, yeah, those two guys can speak at the conference. And me, it's like, from my journey, I just knew that if you're going to try something like this, the nucleus had to be a gathering of saints to have any hope of any success. It had to have a nucleus of high integrity at the core, or it's doomed. It's just doomed. All the self-seeking will just tear it apart. And anyway, so Mr. Reliable, Mr. Copycat, these guys I had, try to do my best to forget about them. Here they were being thrown in my face. And I'm the guy putting up the money to have this conference and to have these guys speak. Anyway, so I tried to tell them that if we haven't even gotten off the ground yet, and we've got these people that I know are scoundrels, and they're going to be the guys talking at this thing. And I was just like, we're dead. We're dead. We're dead before we start. If these are the guys that are going to be like the speakers for this thing. And none of them understood. And back to why the hell was I there? So none of them understood what I was talking about. Yeah, they thought integrity. Oh, well, some have some. They didn't get that it was the key. You don't have integrity, the rest doesn't mean anything. And that's good for life in general. But in this, if it doesn't start with the best, highest integrity, don't even try, don't even start. And so we were aligning with people that I knew were criminals. And I'm just like, we're doomed. Well, anyway, what happened was that these people, I started talking about what these guys had done, and they were like, well, they decided they wouldn't have them maybe talk at this thing, but not because of their behaviors. It was because they didn't want to make me, the guy putting up the money, they didn't want to make me uncomfortable or something, which was the totally wrong answer. It shouldn't have. And I was just, anyway, right after that, I told Brian I wanted out. I said, Brian, I want out. I know I think it was the same week. I just said, Brian, this isn't, I want out, man. It's like these people, this isn't it. And I just realized that these people they were a bunch of newbies. They were a bunch of naive newcomers and stuff. Didn't get it. And I was like, no way I want to be in the same canoe with them. Yeah, they were just totally naifs. And so, in fact, during that board meeting, Alden and Alden's walking through the room, and I'm talking with actually Brian and Gene, and Alden comes up to me, he actually sort of taps me on the shoulder, and he hands me this 2 or 3 page paper. And I looked at it, and I write about this. I won't get too far into this, but back in 2001, I think 2002, maybe no, I think 2002. There was a guy, actually a high-profile activist, who actually read a lot of my work. He invited me to his organization, except they had a free energy section on their website, and the section started off with that libelous article. And I wrote to the guy, I said, I can't be involved in an effort that your free energy section literally with a smear of my partner Dennis. I can't be involved with that. And this guy didn't get it. And so what he did, though, is he wrote the 10-page essay that Mr. Libeler wrote. This guy he narrowed it down. He distilled into a 2-page summary that left out the smear part of Dennis as a way to I guess, assuage my concerns, except the 10 page was still there. And I was like, nice try, but that's not gonna. I mean, you're still promoting the smear of Dennis. And in fact, that guy, I wasted 2 days of my life writing about a 40-page letter to the guy with my giving the story of our journey, and this guy didn't get it at all. In fact, his response after that was, "If you and Dennis and Mr. Minter were so talented, I don't see why you couldn't deliver free energy to the world." And this guy was he was actually pretty famous. And I was just like, this guy's an idiot, you know? So in fact, what happened was I got put into a room with that guy last year without my, without my assent. And I was in a room with this guy, the same guy. Yeah, 25 years later or something, here's this guy again. It's like this stuff keeps coming back. It's like I can't escape this stuff. I'm sure there's some sort of mystical lesson in it for me, some kind. But anyway, so Alden hands me. In fact, this the abbreviated 2 page version was written for my benefit, trying to still bring me on board. And I said, not good enough. And Alden hands it to me as I'm sitting there talking to Gene and Brian. And he sort of like taps my shoulder and he hands me this thing. And I just go, ah. And I kind of said some explosive like, Jesus, yeah. And Brian and Gene were like, why was I reacting like this? And it's like, oh my God. And I just knew at that moment we didn't have a snowball's chance. Not a snowball's chance, you know. And in fact, the funny thing was that the thing Alden handed me was actually, I think, copied by. This is how small world this is. So, I've written about this. You see my videos where when we were raided back in '88, there was a cameraman for a free energy conference who was actually at our facility looking for work, who happened to be there as the raid happened. He got the scoop of his life and he filmed it. And Dennis hired the guy, and he worked for us for the next 6 months. And then when Dennis got arrested, and anyway, this guy stole several $1,000s of camera equipment from us on his way out the door. So again, just more of the criminality that I'm unfortunately too used to. And so when Brian sort of kicked out Alden's first assistant, this guy became Alden's second assistant. In fact, Alden told me about this guy, and he said, yeah, and I heard the guy's name, and I go, him? I couldn't believe it. It was like, yeah, so anyway, so this guy was helping Alden out. And I guess, and Alden said it was helpful, but I'm just going, okay, well, don't let him get his hands in your pockets too deep, maybe. Yeah, so this guy, in fact, this guy actually heckled. He actually was sort of, when Dennis was flying high in 96, 97, there was a guy speaking there in the Bay Area where this guy was from. And this guy was actually heckling the guy. So this guy was, again, he was another one of Dennis's many assailants. And he ends up being Alden's assistant. When I heard that, I was like, oh, man. Yeah, I had so many events like that where it was kind of hard to believe at first. Like, okay, I guess that makes sense. Crazy. So yeah, it can be a small world in this milieu. So again, so anyway, we left the board meeting there on a Saturday, and on Sunday I flew back home to Seattle, and then Monday. So I think it was on a Sunday, maybe Monday, where I was like asking Brian to get out. But at the same time, though, I had committed not only to put up the seed money, but Brian had a New Energy Movement website created, which was kind of homegrown. So I committed to getting it funded to make it professionally done. And so I did. I actually, after making some inquiries, I then hired this guy named Steve Myers, who was actually one of Bucky Fuller's pupils. In fact, he's the guy who called me a comprehensivist. And I didn't know what he meant, so he had me do some of Fuller's work. Steve, though, as he started to work on the site, he wiped out the old one before he built the new one. And I had my own website, etc. I worked at the .com. That was such a rookie move. It was like a super rookie move, and I knew I was in trouble. I was going, oh my God, this guy did. I mean, again, as webmastering 101, you don't wipe out the old website before you put up the new one. I couldn't believe he did that. So anyway, I felt like I was in trouble with him. and I ended up paying him $10,000 for him professionally mastering the site. And he actually used state of the art tools called cascading style sheets. One of the reasons it cost so much, and then it turned out that when I quit, which was coming soon, and we handed it over to uh, that board member who kept begging for money, who actually got a bunch of money from me. Uh, he didn't have the technical skills to do it, manage the site. So the whole thing got wiped out. So that $10,000 was eventually flushed down a toilet, a few months later. Yeah, I spent 17,000 of my own money on my NAM adventure. And But anyway, so on Monday though, I'd heard that, and again, Mr. Libel or Mr. Copycat, they weren't going to be speakers. At least I guess while I was funding the show, and but Malov had committed to be the first conference speaker. So there on Monday, I heard that Malov had agreed to be the first conference speaker. In fact, he was going to do it by video or something. But anyway, he was going to be the first speaker. And again, same day that Steve wiped out the NAM site, and I'm working 12-hour days at the office. And I remember I was coming home. Again, it was what was that, 45? Yeah, and I was coming home, and I was trying to put out the brush fires at NAM while I was, between my 12-hour days. And I did though. So I eventually got the waters calmed. And by the end of the week, we were back on track. And I didn't want to be there, but I gotten us back on track to where the site's going, et cetera. Malov's on board, et cetera. And Brian actually wrote me on Friday evening. Brian wrote me an email thanking me for holding it together. And then he wrote this statement. He wrote, sometimes the best projects try to be psychically sabotaged in its early stages. Thanks for hanging in there. Something is happening. So Brian's funny bone was quivering, and so he knew something was up. Well, when Brian wrote that, the police were just discovering Malov's body because he had been murdered at the same time. So literally 4 days after he'd committed to be our first speaker, he was murdered. Sometimes a murder is just a murder, but untimely deaths abound in this milieu. In fact, ultimately, for years it was unsolved, and now they say it was his tenants, Malov's tenants, who murdered him. How to say it? The official story, I doubt I'll ever really truly fully buy the official story. That was just too weird. In fact, spooked Brian. Understandably, I did not blame Brian for being spooked by that. And Brian at that moment went AWOL. And so, in fact, Mr. Newcomer in Portland there and we were the two guys that were making NAM happen then. And Brian was actually looking for a place. He was planning his move to South America after that. In fact, he was gone. He was gone for months, and we had basically almost no contact with him. Yeah, he was definitely not being the CEO of a new energy movement. He was just out there again trying to find really about to flee the United States. And so, more of the stress of the whole thing. And so, but again, I totally get Brian being spooked by that. So yeah, he soon left South America. He soon left for South America. And in those days, in fact, we got Brian on the Rents show for an interview once, and then and I loved hearing Brian talk. He was a very good public speaker, and when I was hearing him talk, it was really wonderful. Again, they would just to have Brian launched out there prominent with this message. That was really what I was hoping for, and so we got a little bit of that. So the Rent show is like that. In fact, Brian, he told me that he thought he and I were the two guys who would engage the left. So we're the guys who are going to interest the left in this stuff. Ha ha ha. So, but again, I was interacting with Ed Herman at that time. So I tried to introduce Brian to Ed 3 or 4 times, and Ed was never interested, which was, again, typical of the left. And again, Ed was the most, arguably the world's leading media analyst at the time. So in his 80s, I didn't begrudge him that. And so, but yeah, I was never interested. So that didn't work. Yeah, I tried. I gave it my best shot to introduce Ed to Brian. Didn't work out. I'm still sort of how to say it, curious how that might have done if Ed and Brian really could have tangoed. Was not to be. And then Mr. Newcomer, he was out there again, not only church groups, etc. In fact, I'll get into here in a future post, but he was banging on, he did the usual, banging on the doors, the Pentagon, all this stuff, and looking for allies, looking for deep pockets, all that kind of stuff. And there was a guy named Sterling Allen who had his own free energy organization. He was from Utah, and I heard about this, one of the board members. So Mr. Newcomer went out there, met Sterling, and was trying to get Sterling all on board with the new energy movement. And Sterling's response was when he mentioned Brian was Sterling said, "Oh, Brian, the guy with the pig." Back to Brian's lapis pig thing. So he was basically just ridiculing Brian, going, "Yeah, the guy with the pig, he's useless." And I'll deal with Sterling here in the next post. And uh, yeah, it was again back to trying to find allies for this wasn't easy. And so yeah, a lot of dead ends. And I'm gonna again there was and I could make this a very long post series of posts. Again, just the nutty stuff I saw. Again, just my brief tenure there. The stuff I saw was just again, it was just craziness. It was all this craziness. And one of the things that kind of epitomized it was again back to Yul Brown. So I think I mentioned it. Did I mention it? No, I haven't really gotten to Yul Brown much in the past, but and I will get to it in my real history when I get to my brief stint back with Dennis. But Yul Brown was a theoretical inventor of Brown's gas. He probably actually wasn't, but he's the guy who made it pop and fast called Brown's gas to this day. When Dennis teamed with Yul, Yul was actually headquartered there in LA, Southern California. And back then, 96, 97, I actually interacted with Yul's followers out there on the internet. I was taking all comers back then, and they were a naive bunch. I mean, they really were really naive. And as that as we're that summer, I think as we're planning this conference, and I ended up talking to Alden a fair amount. And anyways, and one day it came up about Yul, and I mentioned about we had dealings with Yul, and I said that Yul really left Dennis high and dry, and again Dennis paid Yul $250,000 as his commission for like $1 million of Brown's gas machines that we bought from China. And I mentioned that to Alden. I said, "Yeah, he paid him $250,000," and Alden challenged me. He goes, "What do you mean he paid him $250,000?" And I'm like, "He paid him $250,000." And Alden goes, "What?" And I'm like, "Money." And anyway, Alden said, "Well, the Yule camp there in Southern California, they were telling Yule that Dennis had no money, so Dennis was flat broke and stuff." Which wasn't true, but they're like, "Yeah, Dennis has no money." So they were trying to dissuade Yule from getting involved with Dennis. Dennis had no money. And I guess Yule didn't tell them about the $24 million that Dennis paid Yule. In fact, I stayed. Dennis rented out a room, a hotel resort there in Jersey, which I actually stayed at back there in November of '96 when I first started because it was for Yule. Dennis had really bought this guy a hotel room that Yule didn't stay in. He didn't stay. Again, Dennis treated Yule like a king, paid him like one. And Alden was like challenging me that Dennis had paid Yule anything, and I was like, "Where's this coming from?" And it's like, "Oh yeah, these Yule supporters there in LA just kept telling him that Dennis didn't have any money when Dennis paid him $250,000 and more." And so on one hand, here's these Yule supporters telling Alden that Dennis had no money. And on the other hand, I got Mr. Liberal here saying that Dennis took $100 million from his victims. So it was $100 million or zero. Yeah, this was the board members. It's like this is what I'm $100 million or zero with Dennis. It's just this is the craziness. This is the craziness that was again, it just came with its territory. This really just crazy stuff I was hearing all the time. So, but Alden, actually, to Alden's credit, I told Alden what had happened, and basically, Yule would never sign any agreement that Dennis could use to get a deal done. Yeah, Dennis and I eventually approached the Department of Energy because Brown's gas actually does did low energy nuclear reaction. It would transmute nuclear waste, and Dennis was trying to approach the federal government on the Department of Energy on this, and I'll get to that another time. But uh, but yeah, so Yule wouldn't sign anything. In fact, he made insane demands. It's like, I want $5 billion before I do anything again, kind of thing. Yeah, Dennis is just supposed to hand Yule $5 million and Yule wouldn't have to sign a thing. And yeah, by the way, Dennis, you're working with $10 million next. This is what Yule was doing. And it basically left Dennis high and dry. It really screwed Dennis over real good. In fact, this really hurt. Yeah, Dennis put all his eggs in Yule's basket, a bunch of them. Most of his eggs got put in Yule's basket, and Yule definitely betrayed Dennis. And that was kind of what Yule had done. That was it for me and inventors. And it was like, yeah, these guys are not the answer. But when I told Alden about what Yule had done, Alden was like, yep, that sounds just like Yule. So I think I got Alden over a hump on that. We really did pay Yule $250,000. Anyway, so that summer, as Brian was gone, he was in South America and globetrotting again, kind of afraid to be in the United States at that time, understandably. Um, and here comes this conference, and I'm working ungodly hours at my job. Um, I was taking in the money from the website of people registering, et cetera. And so anyway, so I and Mr. Newcomer there, we were the two guys getting it all ready to go. And so in September in 2004 in Portland was where they had this meeting, this conference. And so the last place in the world I wanted to be was at this conference. I did not want to come again. I didn't want to be there at all. I didn't want to be involved with all this. But Brian basically, he got me to promise. I promised him that I would stay until the conference. And I was planning to quit right after the conference. That was my plan. And so anyway, so I went there and I worked the registration desk with my wife actually. And so we saw the attendees. They came through our registration desk, and there were definitely, my wife even said, there are some shady looking guys. And I'm sure, I'll guarantee you, there were spooks there. There were CIA was there. Global Elite guys were there. This is how it is. It comes to the territory. And in fact, Stephen Greer, he spoke at the conference that first day. In fact, I took an hour and a half off to listen to him talk. I had my wife man the registration just that afternoon while I listened to him talk, and I'm glad I did. That was the first time I heard about the $100 billion in quiet money payouts by the global elite. I think was then, and then I think I heard it also about the Mormon financial empire during that talk. I think it was, or maybe the book right after that. But that was when I heard when I saw this thing about the Mormon financial empire was a ringleader of the global elite. That was one of my isn't that interesting moments because Mormons stole both our Seattle and Ventura companies. So anyway, again, that's Brian trusted Greer, and that went a long way with me. And so Greer, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that Greer says I'm down with. Greer's definitely made his steps, and I'll get into that in probably another day. But in general, though, yeah, the picture he paints, I think, is pretty accurate of what's going on, global elite, etc. Well, anyway, so it was a 2-day conference, and so and I met my wife and I. In fact, Brian was having some dinner for the board members and stuff, and I was already on my way out. So it was like, and I can't remember how exactly it went. But in fact, some members were saying Wade's out. I remember this got back to me. They were like, yeah, Wade's done. And I was, but they were like, how was we done what I wanted or not kind of thing. And so the second day of the conference, there wasn't much for me to do because most registration had happened, day one. And so anyway, yeah, there were 500 people there, some number like that, I think, at this conference. And so I get to the registration table and I sit down and getting ready to deal with whoever I need to deal with, who needs my services. And 20 feet away from me is Brian and this beggar board member giving bear hugs to Mr. Libeler. Yeah, he showed up. So, but yeah, he just showed up out of the blue, and Brian and this guy, they were giving bear hugs to this guy, this Libeler, Mr. Libeler. And when I saw that, I packed up my desk, packed up my computer, was out. I was out the door in 20 minutes. I said, I'm done. My wife and I, we drove back to Seattle that day. And I said, I'm done, man. Yeah. So they were giving bear hugs to Mr. Leibler. Yeah, I just knew they didn't have a prayer. With people like Mr. Leibler in their ranks, they didn't have a chance. And in fact, it was the next morning I sent the email to Brian and everybody said, I quit. I'm done. I stayed till the conference, and that was all I wanted to do. And I could go on. I could, yeah, I could be, this could have been a very long post. That's sort of the highlights of what my NEM days were. Yeah, so it cost me 17,000. My wife actually was glad I did it because it kind of got out of my system. Yeah, so in fact, it helped lead to my current approach. Yeah, so I was done with all mass movement efforts after that. It's like never again will I be involved in a mass movement effort. Doesn't mean I've given up, but the whole mass movement mentality isn't going to work for this. And it certainly can't align with people who I know are criminals at the ground floor. Yeah, ground floor criminals, you're guaranteed you're doomed. And then the day I resigned, so the very day I resigned on that Monday, John Mack, who was a close colleague, but in fact, John Mack is alien abduction stuff. And John Mack was another close colleague and close friend of Brian's. And he came to a violent end that day. So he was run over by a so-called drunk driver there in England that day. So the conference was bookended by the murder of Malov and the violent death of Mack. And Brian couldn't move to South America fast enough. Yeah, by literally within a month, he was in South America, and he spent the rest of his life down there. And so, so anyway, that was a very brief version of my adventures with Brian with the New Energy Movement, and I can't regret it. And it was the end for me on any kind of movement like that. I realize that none of that's going to work. It has to aim higher. Any movement that's going to be successful has to aim far higher than that. And naivete and stuff is people. I mean, we all start out naively, but yeah, they didn't have a prayer. They didn't have a prayer. And again, these people, and they start banging on the Pentagon's door and stuff, and it's like those are the last doors on Earth to bang on. Yeah, it's just like, so I'd hear about it. And I kept giving them money too. After I quit, I still gave them a few $1,000s. So anyway, but it's a thing where, it just didn't have a prayer. Didn't have a prayer. In fact, I'll get us to my next one, but that libelous essay Mr. Leibeler does on New Energy Movement's site today, it still features that essay. Essay still featured on the New Energy Movement site today. So this is, can't escape it. Yeah, it's, I encountered last year. I said with one of these people, and it's just like, how does something like that live forever? I don't know, and get praised and lauded and stuff. I just blows me away. But it doesn't reflect well on. Again, it definitely says that these people involved have no business even trying because they are too naive and too non-discerning. No discernment. And so you can't sort of make excuses for criminal behavior and stuff, and then think these people are going to be your partners in making something like this happen. I mean, that's the greatest delusion of all is thinking that a deadly delusion. Yeah, you can't get in a life. You can't be in a life with people like that. They will slit your throat at the first chance. But anyway, some of that's going to come later, which again actually is even more surreal than what I've described so far. In fact, as a little preview, Brian got kicked out of New Energy Movement soon thereafter. In fact, I didn't have contact with Brian for years after that. When we did, the first thing he did was complain to me about how he had been ganged up on and kicked out of the New Energy Movement. Just like he got kicked out of the New Science Organization back there in the 90s that he founded. Yeah, so the founder, it's a close cousin of Dennis getting his company stolen from him. Yeah, so that kind of behavior, that kind of stuff going on, they don't have a prayer. Organizations do that kind of stuff. For this, the biggest event in the human journey, not a prayer. Not a prayer. So anyway, God bless them all, but not a prayer. And so, so that's all I have for now.